30 Gangsters Ambushed Bumpy Johnson at a wedding. 6 minutes later, only Bumpy walked out alive. The organ music died instantly as the cathedral doors slammed open. 30 men, heavy with weapons and bad intentions, flooded the sanctuary. In the front pew, Bumpy Johnson didn't turn around. He just straightened his tie. The stained glass of St. Aloysius turned the morning sun into a mosaic of blood red and royal blue, casting long, colored shadows across the pews. It was a Saturday in June, the kind of day Harlem usually reserved for stickball and open hydrants. But inside the cool stone walls, the air smelled of lilies, beeswax, and the starched collars of men who usually wore work clothes. Bumpy Johnson sat in the front pew, his hands folded in his lap. He wasn't the father of the bride. That was Dutch, his oldest lieutenant. But everyone knew who had paid for the white silk dress and the reception hall down the street. To the 300 souls packed into the church, Bumpy was more than a boss. He was the uncle who made sure the rent was paid and the lights stayed on. The priest, Father O'Malley, raised his hands to bless the couple. "Peace be with you," he intoned. Bumpy closed his eyes for a second. In his world, peace was a luxury item, expensive and rare. You couldn't buy it. You could only lease it between wars. He enjoyed the silence, the sacred weight of the moment where the violence of the street was forbidden to enter. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave didn't just open. They exploded inward. The sound was like a thunderclap trapped in a bottle. The wooden beams shuddered. The organist faltered, his hand hitting a dissonant, screeching chord. A wind rushed in from the street, carrying the smell of exhaust and impending death. The congregation turned, gasps rippling through the room like a wave. But Bumpy didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He just watched the priest's face go pale. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the lease on peace expiring. The sound of 30 pairs of heavy boots marching on marble echoed like a drumroll of doom. They moved in formation, 2 by 2, fanning out as they breached the nave. These weren't local boys. Harlem boys knew the rules. You didn't touch a man when he was with his family, and you never, under any circumstances, brought a weapon into the house of God. But these men were different. They were from across the river, hired guns with no respect for the code and no fear of the lightning. They wore long coats, heavy with the weight of Thompson submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns concealed beneath the wool. Panic swept through the pews like a wildfire. Women screamed, pulling their children under the benches. Men who had survived street wars and prison riots froze, their eyes darting to the exits, only to find them blocked by the gunmen. The bride, terrified, dropped her bouquet. The white roses hit the floor, looking suddenly like a wreath for a grave. Bumpy stood up. He didn't rush. He rose with the same slow, deliberate gravity of the priest raising the chalice. He turned around to face the invasion. At the head of the column stood a man named Rico the Razor. Rico was a climber, a man who mistook brutality for power. He had been trying to muscle in on the numbers racket for months, and Bumpy had shut every door in his face. Now, Rico had decided to kick the door down. "Sorry to interrupt the ceremony, folks," Rico shouted, his voice grating against the sacred acoustics. He grinned, a predator looking at a flock of sheep. But the groom ain't the only one getting lucky today. Dutch, the father of the bride, made a move. His hand went to his waistband, instinct overriding the reality that he was unarmed. Bumpy's hand shot out, gripping Dutch's wrist. It was a vice grip, painful and absolute. "Don't," Bumpy whispered. "He wants you to move. He wants an excuse to spray this whole room." Bumpy looked at the men surrounding them. He counted the barrels. He calculated the angles. 30 men, heavily armed. They had the high ground, the numbers, and the element of surprise. In any other tactical manual, this was a checkmate. It was a slaughter waiting for a signal. But Bumpy saw something else. He saw nervousness in the eyes of the younger gunmen. He saw them glancing at the crucifix hanging above the altar, twitching at the sound of a crying baby. They were superstitious. They knew they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Rico walked down the center aisle, stepping on the bride's train. He stopped 10 feet from Bumpy, confident, arrogant, untouchable. "End of the road, old man," Rico sneered. "I told you I'd come for you. Didn't think I'd find you on your knees." The air in the church was so thin it felt like a vacuum. 300 people held their breath, waiting for the first bullet to tear through the silence. They looked at Bumpy, their protector, waiting for him to beg, to plead, or to die. Bumpy adjusted his cufflinks. He looked at Rico with an expression of mild annoyance, as if the man were a fly buzzing around his dinner. "You brought 30 men," Bumpy said, his voice calm, carrying to the back of the room without shouting. "You must be scared to death of me." Rico's laugh was ugly, a sharp bark that bounced off the vaulted ceiling. He enjoyed the math of the situation. 30 guns against one old man in a suit. He felt like a giant. "Scared?" Rico mocked, stepping closer, the barrel of his shotgun rising until it was level with Bumpy's chest. "Nah, Bumpy, I ain't scared. I'm just thorough. I wanted to make sure you didn't have anywhere to run. No back doors, no tunnels, just you, me, and the Lord Almighty watching you bleed out on this pretty marble floor." He swung the shotgun wildly, aiming it momentarily at the bride, who sobbed into her hands. "Maybe I'll take the whole wedding party with me. Send a message to the rest of Harlem. The old guard is dead. There are no rules anymore." The gunmen behind Rico shifted their weight. They were killers, yes, but shooting a mob boss was one thing. Massacring a wedding in a church was another. It was bad luck. It was the kind of thing that haunted you. Bumpy saw that hesitation. He stepped away from Dutch, moving into the center of the aisle. He made himself the only target, drawing the eyes of every barrel in the room. He walked until the shotgun was inches from his heart. "You're right, Rico," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that felt heavy, like stones settling in a riverbed. "There are no rules for men like you. That's why you'll never run this city. You think power is pulling a trigger. You don't understand that power is knowing when not to." Bumpy looked past Rico, locking eyes with a young gunman near the door. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, his face slick with sweat, his finger trembling on the trigger of a pistol. "I'm going to give you boys one chance," Bumpy announced, addressing the room, not the leader. "Just one. This is a house of prayer. I don't want to stain it. Turn around. Walk out those doors. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and I will let you live." Rico's face twisted in disbelief. "You'll let us live? Look around, old man. You're a ghost already." "I'm not talking to you, Rico," Bumpy said, never blinking. "You're already dead. You died the second you kicked that door open. I'm talking to the boys behind you who still have a soul left to save." He took a step closer to Rico, chest to barrel. "Walk away," Bumpy commanded, "or stay here forever." The silence that followed was agonizing. For a second, just a split second, the line of gunmen wavered. The weight of Bumpy's legend pressed down on them. They remembered the stories, the men who tried to kill him and vanished, the enemies found in the river. But Rico saw his authority slipping. He couldn't let them back down. He snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Nobody moves!" Rico screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I want his head, now!" Bumpy sighed. It was a sad sound. He had offered them grace. They had chosen hell. "Father," Bumpy said, his eyes finally leaving Rico to look at the priest. "Get down." The boom of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. It should have been the end. At that range, Rico shouldn't have missed. But rage makes a man clumsy, and fear makes him blind. Bumpy didn't duck. He stepped. A single, calculated slide to the left, smooth as a dancer. The The buckshot tore past his shoulder, shredding the velvet cushion of the pew behind him and sending a cloud of white feathers into the air like snow. "Kill him!" Rico screamed, racking another shell. That command was the match in the powder keg. The 29 men behind him opened fire, but they made the amateur's mistake. They were bunched in the center aisle, shoulder to shoulder, fighting for a sightline. Bumpy was gone, diving low into the maze of heavy oak pews. The air turned into a storm of lead. Bullets chewed through the wood, shattering the ancient slate floor, sparking against the stone pillars. The noise was physically painful, a continuous roar that drowned out the screams of the congregation huddled on the floor. Bumpy moved on his hands and knees. He didn't crawl, he hunted. He knew this church. He knew the spacing of the benches. He knew where the shadows were deepest. The smoke from the gunpowder mixed with the incense, creating a thick, gray fog. Visibility dropped to 0. The gunmen were firing at ghosts. "I can't see him," one boy yelled, his voice high with panic. "Just shoot," Rico roared. A spray of submachine gun fire raked the pews. A gunman in the second row jerked and fell, hit in the back by his own man behind him. The panic set in. They weren't fighting Bumpy Johnson anymore. They were fighting the legend of him. Every shadow looked like the boogeyman. Every creak of wood sounded like death. Bumpy reached the end of the pew. He saw a pair of legs standing in the aisle, a gunman trying to reload. Bumpy rose up. He didn't have a gun, but he didn't need one yet. He grabbed the man's tie, yanking him down into the darkness of the pew. There was a sickening crack, and the man went limp. Bumpy took the pistol from his hand. Now he was armed. He didn't spray and pray. He waited. He listened to the breathing, the clicking of empty magazines. He popped up, bang, bang, and dropped back down. 2 men fell. He moved again, shifting positions before they could return fire. He was a phantom, appearing on the left, then the right. The gunmen started spinning in circles, firing at nothing, firing at each other. "Stop shooting." "You're hitting us!" someone screamed. Rico was hyperventilating, his shotgun empty. He stood in the middle of the carnage, his eyes wide and stinging from the smoke. "Show yourself, old man!" Bumpy stepped out from behind a marble pillar, 10 feet away. The chaos had thinned the herd. Bodies lay scattered in the aisle. The remaining men were wounded, empty, or paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the situation. Bumpy raised the pistol. He didn't aim at Rico. He aimed at the massive crystal chandelier hanging by a chain directly above the cluster of remaining gunmen. He fired once. The chain snapped. Gravity did the rest. The chandelier crashed down with the force of a bomb, glass shrapnel exploding outward, crushing 3 men and sending the rest scrambling back toward the doors. Rico stood alone. His army was broken. His ammunition was gone. He looked at Bumpy, who stood amidst the ruin, his suit dusted with plaster, but his body untouched. Bumpy checked his watch. 6 minutes, he said, his voice cutting through the ringing in Rico's ears. "I gave you 6 minutes to live. You wasted them." Rico reached for a backup piece in his boot, but his hands were shaking too hard. He fumbled it. Bumpy walked forward, kicking the gun away. He stood over Rico, looking down with the disappointment of a father looking at a wayward son. The church was silent again, save for the moans of the wounded and the settling of dust. The battle was over. The massacre had happened, but not the one Rico planned. The silence that followed the crash of the chandelier was heavier than the noise of the battle. It was a suffocating, ringing silence, punctuated only by the dripping of holy water from a punctured font and the groans of men who would never stand up again. Rico lay on the floor, pinned under the twisted brass and crystal, his legs crushed, his ambition extinguished. He looked up at Bumpy with eyes that had lost their fire, replaced by a dull, animalistic confusion. He couldn't understand how the math had failed. He couldn't understand how 30 guns had lost to 1 man. Bumpy didn't look at him again. Rico was no longer a threat. He was just debris. Bumpy dropped the pistol. It hit the floor with a metallic clatter, the only loud sound in the room. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a white handkerchief, and wiped a smudge of gunpowder from his cheek. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket, checking for tears. There were none. He turned his back on the carnage and walked toward the altar. Dutch was slowly rising from behind the communion rail, his arms still wrapped protectively around his daughter. The bride was shaking, her white dress covered in gray dust, but she was whole. The groom looked up at Bumpy as if looking at a ghost. "Is she hurt?" Bumpy asked. His voice was gentle, the same voice he had used to wish them peace before the doors opened. Dutch checked her. No, Bumpy. She's okay. We're all okay." "Good," Bumpy nodded. "I'm sorry about the ceremony. We'll pay for a new one, somewhere quiet." "Bumpy," Dutch started, looking past him at the aisle of bodies. "How did you—" Bumpy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was written in the wreckage. He turned around to face the doors, the long, straight path back to the world. The aisle was a gauntlet of destruction, splintered wood, shattered glass, and the broken bodies of the men who had come to kill him. Bumpy began to walk. He moved with a slow, rhythmic cadence. Step, crunch, step, crunch. He stepped over a submachine gun. He stepped around a man clutching his shoulder. He didn't hurry. To run would be to show fear, and Bumpy Johnson had left fear behind in the pews. As he reached the back of the church, the heavy doors that Rico had kicked open were hanging off their hinges, revealing a rectangle of blinding white light. The world outside had continued to spin, oblivious to the 6 minutes of war that had just raged inside. Bumpy paused at the threshold. He took a deep breath, expelling the acrid taste of smoke from his lungs. He adjusted his fedora, pulling the brim low. He stepped out. The Harlem sun hit him, warm and indifferent. The street was quiet. The neighbors, hearing the shooting, had vanished indoors. Bumpy stood alone on the church steps, the only man upright, the only man walking. He looked down 135th Street, watching a pigeon peck at a crumb on the sidewalk. Life went on. The sirens arrived too late, as they always did. By the time the first police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of St. Aloysius, the only thing left to arrest was the silence. Detective Miller walked into the sanctuary and stopped dead. He had seen gang wars before. He had seen alleys painted red and warehouses riddled with holes. But he had never seen a church turned into a slaughterhouse where the intended victim walked away without a scratch. He looked at the chandelier lying on top of the men who had come to kill a king. He looked at the pews, chewed to splinters by submachine gun fire. He looked at the empty spot where Bumpy Johnson had stood. "Who did this?" a rookie officer asked, his face green as he looked at the carnage. "Must have been a whole army, Sarge." Miller shook his head, lighting a cigarette to cover the smell of cordite. "No army, kid. Just one man." By sunset, the story wasn't just news. It was gospel. It moved through the barber shops, the jazz clubs, and the stoops of brownstones. The numbers grew with every telling. 30 men, 50 men, 100. They said bullets passed through him like he was made of smoke. They said he caught a shotgun shell with his bare hand. The truth was simpler, but far more terrifying. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a ghost. He was simply a man who understood that fear is a currency. And he was the richest man in town. That evening, miles away from the yellow police tape, Bumpy sat in his usual booth at the 22 West. He was eating a steak, medium rare. His suit was fresh, his tie perfectly knotted. There was no blood on his hands. When the waiter poured his water, his hand shook. Bumpy looked up, offering a small, tired smile. "Relax, son," Bumpy said softly. "The war is over. It's quiet now." Rico, the razor, had learned the final lesson of Harlem mathematics. You can bring 30 guns. You can bring the element of surprise. But you never, ever bet against the house. And in this city, Bumpy Johnson was the house.